Suman, let's start with you, if I may. We've just actually started broadcasting to Facebook, so I'll just quickly remind everyone who's joining us on Facebook who we are speaking with in this session. So Tamsiel Hussain, who's the Chief Executive and founder of People Like Us Create in India, and also from Suman Basnet, who's the Regional Asia Pacific Director for the World Association of Community Broadcasters in Nepal. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So Suman, let's start with you if we may. Could you tell us a little bit about the World Association of Community Broadcasters, what it does and who it is that you're supporting?
Okay, thank you, Corinne. Thanks for having me here, and nice to be with everyone who is here today. The World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters, we call it AMARC in short, and a lot of people ask us how we got that acronym. Actually, its original name is in French, which I can barely pronounce, and I won't even dare. And AMARC is the acronym of that name in French language, and we call it the World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters in English. And this is primarily a membership-based organization. It's an international association of community radios. And we also have civil society organizations in our membership, civil society organizations that support community broadcasting, freedom of media, independent media, freedom of expression, human rights, and so on. In general terms, speaking in approximate numbers, we have about 10,000 members in almost 113 countries of the world. My office looks after the Asia Pacific region. I boast that I look after half of humanity, which is hardly possible, really. But we have close to about 1,500 members in about 23 countries. So that's AMARC in short. Generally speaking, AMARC, let me also first mention that AMARC has autonomous regional chapters in almost every continent. So you have AMARC Europe, AMARC Latin America and Caribbean, AMARC Africa, and there you have AMARC Asia Pacific, the secretariat of which is here in Kathmandu. Now, speaking in general terms, AMARC works at three levels. One is we engage in policy advocacy, and that's one of our main pillars of our work. It's to ensure that the legislative and policy framework is such that community radios can be set up and that they can thrive. That's the shortest explanation I can give for that kind of a work. And then we engage with the grassroots to make the idea of community radio popular. So we not only tell people that community radio is important for to preserve and promote your human rights, your right to speak, your right to communicate, your right to information, and so on. But community radio at the same time is also important for local education, local literacy, very important for the small family farmers, for women's empowerment, or even for promoting climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction and so on. So we go to the grassroots to tell people, to excite them about community radio, if you like. And then thirdly, we always hope to arrive at a point where the government is willing to give out the licenses and people are willing to invest their resources on setting up radios, and therefore we engage in capacity building. We help people learn the hardware and the software aspect of community radios. So that's generally that's the third pillar, and that basically in a very brief manner explains what community radio does. But in addition to all of these, we have some specific thematic focus areas that we like to work in. And these thematic focus areas keep changing in time. We have a General Assembly that meets every 4 years, and the last one was in 2018, December in Yogyakarta, in Jogja, Indonesia. And in that meeting, it was decided that for the next 4 years, AMARC Asia Pacific especially would focus on a couple of very specific thematic areas. And these include, for instance, fighting against gender injustices and inequalities, or for using community radios to help climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction at the grassroots, or fighting against radicalism, ultranationalism, and extremism through community radio, or promoting the rights of displaced people and migrants. And of course, as I said in the beginning, to advocate and lobby to have the right kind of enabling legislative atmosphere for community radios to be set up and to survive. And for all of this, we work very closely with our network of members. AMARC is essentially, as I said in the beginning, a network of community radios. But we also work with donor organizations and UN agencies and so on, foundations, to raise funds and do projects. And when we implement our projects, we may also, again, make sure that we work with existing structures so that we avoid setting up parallel structures, which can at best be of temporary in nature. Secondly, the intention is also to strengthen structures that are already in place at the national levels. And those are primarily, again, the community radios and the national associations and federations. So I can go on forever about AMARC, but that is a brief introduction of AMARC. Thank you.
Well, it is a global organisation and it has been around for a long time. So I think it is really wonderful for people who are on this call to learn that it exists and also to get a sense of the scope and scale of the work that it does. I have quite a...
You just reminded me, thank you, Corinne, just reminded me to mention that AMARC was established in 1983. So it's in its middle ages now. It's quite an old organization.
Wonderful, thank you. So the other guest on this call is Tamsiel Hussain, who is the Chief Executive and founder of People Like Us Create, who joins us now from New Delhi in India. Tamsiel, tell us about PLUC, what it does and its history, and a little bit about how it relates to mobile journalism.
PLUC was, thank you, Corinne. Obviously, it's amazing to be here. Also, it was amazing to learn about AMARC for sure. I didn't know it was established in 1983, so it's quite an old organization. People Like Us Create, or PLUC in short, was started as a mobile journalism network in about 2 years and 10 months ago, exactly, where we were training a community of waste pickers, and we realized that these waste pickers can actually use mobile phones and create change. After that, we started building a lot of communities in various parts of the country, where we started focusing on various kinds of issues, where we started focusing on air pollution, climate change, gender, mental health, internet inequality, and we started building communities around that. People Like Us Create is India's first and only mobile storytelling platform now, which tells premium stories in the form of a platform which we host called PLUC.tv. The second platform that we host is LetMeBreathe.in, which is India's largest climate change and sustainability mobile storytelling platform, where basically a lot of people are telling stories using their phone, about 30,000 of them. Each and every person has been trained by us on issues right from how to edit and shoot videos from their phones to how to identify their stories. It's powered by 30,000 creators who create stories every day, and at the same time, they enable change. Present in about 16 cities in India, and we tell stories in 5 languages, which are very regional in nature. Apart from that, we have partners like Twitter India, Snapchat, Hello, which are a lot of regional apps like Hello, ShareChat. A lot of these partners have partnered up with us to make sure that these stories travel to their social media platforms. Apart from that, these stories are hosted on mainstream media, lots of documentaries are made. So we've created this amazing world of mobile storytelling where people are creating stories that they're passionate about, and these stories are reaching out to communities that are beyond.
Wonderful. Tamsiel, I'm going to ask you to just speak a little slower in the next question, just because the audio is not that great.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and also we'll have people on the call who may not speak English as a first language, so we'll just make sure that everyone can keep up with us, including. Let's not knock that over. Sorry. I've got a lot of equipment around me at the moment. Let's look at community engagement. Engagement is a word that we do quite a bit of work when we talk about journalism. It can mean anything from clicking on a link to trying to build trust with the communities that we serve. What does it mean, Suman, for you in terms of community broadcasters?
In regards to community broadcasting, engagement really goes at a very different level, at the next level, if you like, because community radio is, the essence of community radio is a broadcasting medium that's rooted in the communities. So if you are not engaged not just spiritually, philosophically or conceptually, but in real physical terms, then you can't really serve as a real community broadcaster. It is often said about community radio that community radio is 90% community and 10% radio, and that really explains its close proximity to community radio. Another thing that's very popularly said about community radio is it's the only medium where the producer and the consumer of information are the same. So, even the whole concept definition of a journalist or journalism in community broadcasting changes massively. I mean, when you say community radio, you're talking about the entire diversity that you find in a community. You're not just talking about journalists. Journalists are an important part of community broadcasting, but so are local traders, local farmers, local students, the homemakers, the students, the teachers, and everyone. So the big question, so that's the definition part. The real challenge comes as when you start answering, how do you make that happen? And that has to work at two levels. One is, how do you make that happen at the station level? How do you make sure that you engage with your communities in such a way that that they are fully involved in the entire process of production and dissemination of content and the feedback mechanism, but also at the policy level, that your media law, the broadcasting law in a country actually allows for that. And yeah, please.
And Tamseel, I wanted to ask Tamseel a question around community engagement, because you're quite right, Suman, that community broadcasting is very much driven by community members. In fact, my own entree into radio journalism was as a community broadcaster. But Tamseel, in India, you're not just working with journalists to train people to create content, you're working directly with communities. And I think perhaps to really drive this point home to the people on the call, you're working with sectors within the community. For example, you've just finished a big project training doctors. So I'd love to hear more about that.
So how community is very central to whatever PLUC does, right? We call ourselves a combination of mobile storytelling and public engagement. For a decade before I started PLUC, I was really working on public engagement as to how you engage communities and make sure that they are fighting for the issue that they want to. And when I combine it with mobile storytelling, we realize the power of community is very different when it comes to when you combine storytelling, because for people to identify the story they want to tell and then tell the story and reach out to a larger audience becomes very critical. So taking, let's say, the doctor story example, doctor training example that you mentioned, in the last 2 years, we've trained about 1,000 doctors. And these trainings have resulted in one, obviously, like how you identify a story, how you use your mobile phone to then tell a story, and then fighting the challenges that are there, and how you edit it and make sure that you're influencing in the right way. The biggest thing that the doctors that we've trained, the role that they are playing is fighting fake news. And when we started training, I think the big thing was that what does health news do? Is health news really important? Is health news is not sexy enough for mainstream media. And now you come to a point where health news has become critical for everyone to know about. So in that sense, when we started engaging these doctors, we realized that they're telling a lot of stories organically on checking fake news around health. And second, they want to talk about immunization, vaccines, health issues like malaria, rotavirus, which is a vaccine again in India, to now coronavirus, right? As to how and what it happens and what are the precautions, because there's so much fake news around it. And the role that specifically this community has played, because in every training that we give, the first, apart from basic mobile journalism skills, the first thing you really learn, because you're obviously training in India, is how can you check fake news, right? That becomes very critical. And we've seen doctors, our community of doctors doing amazing work. A lot of them are on the front line as well. And we've seen their stories traveling to the most smallest of the villages to like mainstream media, to a lot of them also like reaching out to global news networks. Yeah.
Looking back at that experience, what has it taught you in terms of the journalism skills that you need to provide people with in order to tell stories, first-person stories that are not just authentic, but have a level of robustness to them from a journalistic point of view?
So the thing is, when you run a crowdsourcing platform, right, where you're getting constant stories, you get all kinds of quality of stories. We have two kinds of creators who are a part of our database, which is 30,000 people, right? One are first-time storytellers, right, which acquire these skills of journalists. Second are pro creators who are already journalists or already been storytellers who understand how this nuance goes. And one of the most, when you're telling first-person narratives, just to make sure that the story is one, evergreen. Second, broader context. The biggest things that we realize is when people start submitting stories, you realize that it's only limited to a first-person account. In order for them to realize how to look at data, how to look at broader facts, and what is the broader narrative, that is the most amount of effort that goes from our editorial team, because you can't just publish on PLUC, right? You need to pass through the story in that editorial team. And during the training, the first-time storytellers, which is most of our database, they get training on one, obviously, basic Mojo, right? How you shoot, edit. The most amount of time that is spent in the training is how to identify your story, which is where your most journalism skills come in. Where's how to fact check, what's the source, all those basic things, and specifically the broader narrative. And we realize, like, even when they start submitting stories, the most common thing is that, like, submitting B-rolls and basic things becomes a challenge, because they're very passionate people. They like to tell first-person narratives, but without getting counter checks, without having a broader narrative, you don't have a holistic story. That's what we spend the most amount of effort in, right from the training process to making sure when the story is going out. And each and every creator has, like, literally 3 stories to experiment with that, where they take a lot of time. And from the 4th story, because they're also getting a revenue share out of the story they're putting out, they need to start knowing how to do it, because the stories start going up from a perspective of looking, like, people look at their stories in a holistic perspective by then.
I think that's one of the really interesting aspects of PLUC, that you have a revenue program for people who are creating content. So you have 30,000 people on your database, as you say, then you have this pro creator level. Just tell us a little bit about how that works in terms of people submitting content that they get paid for, and also how your team works with them to continue to capacity strengthen them to produce really solid journalism as they evolve as storytellers.
So let me give an example. I'll start with an example. And this is during the lockdown, right? It becomes very challenging. Before the lockdown, we used to actually go on the ground, find communities, or the communities used to find us, and we used to go and train them, right? And in order for them to understand why, like, for example, imagine telling farmers in rural Punjab, which is like the agricultural belt of India, why should you use your mobile phone and social media to voice your opinion? But when farmers call you and say that, hey, our opinions are being completely misrepresented by media, we need to voice it on our own and build a community of our own. As soon as they do that, once they've actually told the 3 stories that they've told, in order to get into the revenue model, they need to reach a certain level of quality, which means that these stories, for example, one of the media partners we have is South Asia Monitor, which puts out these stories to South Asia. How do you make sure that these stories are reaching to those communities is what we focus on. Our editorial team is comprised of actually 4 people now, right? Which literally support in editing, production. At the same time, as soon as you get a story, to literally make sure, because we tend to not say no to any story, because we believe like having a central point of view becomes very important. And most of the stories you get, you realize that they're very biased in opinions. So our storytelling and editorial team make sure that it's sending you back. Let's say, for example, you are recording a story which is on an opinion, which is on equal wage for wage pickers in a small, again, town in Punjab, right? And you have to actually make sure that they look at the broader issue and look at the other side of the things. And mostly in first-person narratives, you only get one side of the opinion. So our team spends a lot of time in asking our creators to go back, find the other side of the opinion, find the other side of the story, and come back and create a holistic story, as I mentioned. So that's what a lot of the time the editorial team does. And except for that, I think a lot of time goes in, we're going mad with the amount of stories that come in and literally making sure that these stories are getting edited, produced in a certain way and reaching out, not only to us, but also to our partners, right? The third thing that our editorial team does, which is very critical, is that we produce stories in various visual formats. We use vertical videos, we do horizontal videos, we do long form, we do short form, and we also do visual AMP stories on Google, right? Which is a medium which is text, audio, and visual based, which makes it easier for people to tell story. But in order for creators to submit story and understand why, because these are shorter than articles, but they're very visual in nature. It's like Instagram on Google search. Making sure that these visual formats are doing justice to the stories that the creators are telling. So a lot of that role goes into that. But after 3 months, after a creator has been engaged with us, it becomes easier for the creators to do it themselves.
Excellent. What you're talking about here, both of you, is working with community members who are creating their own story content. In some frameworks, it's called civilian journalism or community storytelling. Both of these forms of storytelling can make newsrooms a little bit nervous, in part, and you've talked about this, because it can be informed more by opinion than by strong editorial ethics and robust journalism. And Tamseel, you've talked about how you address that, but also because particularly at the moment, when we see the collapse of journalism's business model, it worries people that perhaps it's a threat to jobs. I'd be very interested to hear from both of you, working in this space that you do, which is outside of mainstream newsrooms. Do you think that those concerns are justified? Should journalists be concerned about this, or should they be perhaps coming to the party more and working more directly with communities? Suman, do you want to go first?
Yeah.
No, sure. Tamseel, if you want to, it's okay.
Oh.
Please go.
Are you sure? Okay,
Yeah, sure.
great.
Go ahead, Tamseel.
This is how I see it. A lot of the creators that we have are at times, because we come in the bracket of gig economy, right? We don't come in the bracket of mainstream media. We don't come into that bracket. We come into the bracket of gig economy and tech, where we are helping people reach out to communities, train communities at the same time when it comes to journalists, right? So I personally believe that for a journalist, having the amount of pressure that they have in newsrooms already, I'm only going to refer to it as the new normal, which is happening now. The pressure has tripled, right? Because you have job cuts, because you have all those things. And there's so many stories that you actually want to tell, but you're not able to. So we see a lot of journalists from mainstream media houses who feel, because of editorial control, because of all those things, they feel trapped, not being able to tell the story. So like you said, I really feel we've already seen this happen in India, that a lot of journalists are joining the party with digital. They have not only a role to play in making sure that their mainstream media house is getting promotions on digital, but also their own profiles. They all have their individual profiles. They all have their individual campaigns. Where PLUC fits in, which is where the future lies, is how individual journalists are making sure they can tell more and more stories, right? Instead of getting accustomed to an alley where let's say you only cover health feeds, you only cover environment, you're able to cover more stories through a model like PLUC, which is where I think, especially now more than ever, we see a lot more journalists coming to us. It starts with them telling their first story to them wanting to tell more stories, and they immediately come into the leap of pro creators, right? Because they already know how to tell a story, which becomes easier. So there is a massive trend which is changing, and obviously it is the future. It's not something for a lot of media houses, which you say, which are digital in nature, which are not necessarily broadcast in nature. You already see them crowdsourcing at a level, right? And especially during the lockdown, we saw the amount of crowdsourcing that's happening amplify, right? And it becomes easy. And also because this is the power of community, right? When you have 30,000 people in the smallest of villages, smallest of towns, smallest of states, and you want to fact check a story, you want to make sure it's right. I'll give an example. We were doing stories on how pregnant women in Bihar, which is very accessible during lockdown, they're not getting nutrition and adequate medicines. And when we started crowdsourcing the stories, the biggest challenge we faced was, one, any reporter wanted to cover the story because they were so engrossed with all the other stories. But when we started training women and family members telling their own stories, we realized that these stories are very genuine. And these storytellers, when they were telling stories, they were already fighting a stigma in one way, which is, if I tell them that I'm pregnant, what will the government do? Will I be listed in the coronavirus auditing system? Will I be tested? What happens to my baby? And these are things which already happen, right? Apart from that, when you actually tell a story, a lot of times you realize initially, a lot of people were submitting stories which are fake in nature, and we actually had to send some of our creators on ground to be able to go, who had a pass to travel, to be able to go and verify these facts. So beyond just, this is the power you get from a network like this, where if you want to fact check a story that you've told, you get extra support. So in that sense, it becomes amplified, right? It becomes easier for you. You get the experience of a newsroom in a virtual format where you have a network supporting and a community supporting the stories you tell.
Thank you. No, that's excellent. And I think it's a really complex area, and it's great to have that, detailed response. Suman, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then I've got a couple more questions, and then we'll start taking questions from the participants, because I know people, it's sort of, if I ask all the questions and we only have 5 minutes, it's no fun. So we'll open it up very shortly. But Suman, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I was really enjoying listening to Tamseel. I think he was speaking
Me
for
too.
me. Really speaking for community broadcasting as well. I couldn't have agreed more with him. I just like to add one more dimension to what he's already said, is that now that, and it's in some ways it's quite a recent phenomenon that community broadcasters too have started sourcing a lot of their information from online sources, like for instance Facebook, social platforms, and so on. And that creates a real danger of the disinformation, if you like, of spreading. So fact-checking has become a kind of a big line of work in community radio as well, because the danger is one is that you want to validate your information, you want to make sure that you want to give the right information to your listeners, but at the same time you also don't want the government at your throat on the pretext of fake news. Now I mean, it's ironical, but sometimes governments try to use this pretext of fake news to tighten the law so much that you have to take refuge in self-censorship, and we see that happening. We see that happening in many countries already. So it's a very delicate balance that you have to maintain, and therefore you want to give the right information. At the same time, you don't want to go into self-censorship, but at the same time you also want to look at this in a very broad fashion, that your outlook is not limited, at least when it comes to community radio, outlook is not limited only to journalism. What about promoting local languages or traditions, cultures, events, or local dialects, linguistic history or oral history, all of that is also there. So I think some of these discussions sometimes drag us so much into the traditional sense of journalism that I have to keep on reminding myself that community broadcasting is so much more than that. Yeah. Thank you.
So we have quite a large number of people on this call, and so I'm going to start asking one more question. But what I would love is for folks who are in participating to start dropping some questions in. I have the chat open, so I'll be keeping an eye on that, and I can put that to Tamseel and Suman. We hear quite a bit in conferences in Europe and North America about engaged journalism. So the European Journalism Centre has really pioneered a process called the Engaged Journalism Accelerator, for example, and it's very much a conference buzzword. Very keen to hear what you think about the engaged journalism approach and how well you think it would translate to the Asia Pacific region. Tamseel, I know you have some thoughts on this, if that's okay. Might start with you.
So Corinne, engaged journalism is, I've told you this earlier, I think it's a lovely topic to talk about. I love talking about this. The thing that I would talk about is engaged journalism as a business model, if that's okay, because there's lots of scope around it, right? For a model like this, we've already established that engagement is very important. The way we do community engagement requires a part of gamification, which is why you should tell the second story and the third story until it reaches a point when the viewers are watching your story. So when you go on PLUC.tv or when you go on Let Me Breathe, right, it has two kinds of models which come under the engaged journalism thing, right? Where on PLUC TV, in about a month or two, we're launching a subscription model, right? Which really helps people invest in stories, which are, because when you go for PLUC stories, you're looking at views, but you're also looking at impact of two kinds. One is short-term behavior change. Second is long-term behavior change. And the third one, which often tends to happen as a combination of two, is enabling advocacy if on an issue that you're concerned about. So when you start subscribing to shows and stories by creators who are from the 99% of the population, you realize that the model is the way we have to price a lot of our things has to be affordable for a lot of people, right? And the second kind of thing that we follow in engaged journalism is crowdsourcing of stories where you directly submit on a tool, on a platform, where these stories go in written and visual features, right? And they actually get produced by an editorial team after you submit, right? Where you actually have a tool to put it up. So these kind of mechanisms using technology and public engagement, and when you look at training and how you do training at scale, combination of it would make engaged journalism a very easy possibility when it comes to platforms like us, especially we're just like 3 years old. For platforms which are even longer, I feel engaged journalism as a model becomes much more challenging because we as organizations are constantly looking at new methods to earn revenue, right? And subscriber models are the future. We've seen platforms like the Ken is a platform in India. They're doing some amazing work on subscriber models. And there's so much innovation that's needed. I was researching on this. This is not connected to journalism, but I was researching on this OTT platform, which is called Hoi Choi, which only targets a community of Bengalis, a certain set of communities in India, and they have about 1 million users. And if you look at the numbers and analytics as to how people are accessing these videos, which are fiction, entertainment, and newsy in nature on their phones, it's amazing, right? It's a community approach, which is reaching out to the community and getting not only views, but at the same time, revenue out of them. It's a model which is very community-based and language-based, which is very different from, let's say, when you look at an app like QB, right? Which a lot of people say had a massive failure in the launch. But again, the community approach might have helped with a little bit more. Sorry, yeah.
No, that's absolutely fine. I was very, very interested in what you were saying. We don't have many questions in the chat yet, so I'm going to strongly encourage participants. I'll just remind you of who we have here in New Delhi and in Kathmandu, perhaps to nudge along. So we have Suman Basnet, who is the Regional Director for the World Association of Community Broadcasting, and he's been in broadcasting for a very long time. So if there are things that you're interested in terms of perhaps setting up a community broadcaster or working more effectively as a broadcaster with your community, he's the guy to ask. And we also have Tamsiel Hussain, who runs, it's actually not an NGO, it's a social impact startup in New Delhi in India, People Like Us Create. And they've created a crowdsourcing network of 30,000 people creating content which is fact-checked and put out into the world. And they have a revenue model, which is very, very exciting. So this is definitely a great moment to ask those questions. While we're just waiting for a couple more to come through, Suman, I'm very interested in the description you have made of AMARC. As part of its role is to work towards the sustainability of community broadcasting. Now, often community broadcasters are run on an absolute shoestring, so I find in my mind there's a disconnect between making them sustainable. So what does that look like, and what kind of support do you provide?
Thanks, Corinne. Actually, I had a question for Tamseel, but I'll come to that a little later. I really found everything he said very interesting. But let me first address your question. I think the business model for community broadcasting is very different as compared to the business model, if you like, of commercial broadcasters or any other media. It's how shall I put it? Okay, community radio is more like a community heritage. People pay for it, for its upkeep in money or in kind, like religious places or a children's park, and so on and so forth. So community radio works at that level, that if you have the community engaged, then community will look after you. That's the model you follow, and that's the ideal. It doesn't. But you try to meet that ideal, but you're not always successful. So you add different aspects to it, And I'll give you some examples. For instance, there are community radios in Nepal, even in countries like in Indonesia, in some places in India that I know of, where community radios sell subscriptions to households. So one person from each household or the entire household becomes a member of a community radio, and that brings in some income to a community radio. Community radios also sell advertisement slots. So if you have an old bicycle or a buffalo to sell or local produce to sell, you advertise in a community radio station. Community radios, mind you, mostly, there are lots of city-based community radios, but community radios mostly work in very rural communities where commercial broadcasters seldom venture into, because there is no possibility of making a profit, not even income, forget profit. So this is a model that this is a kind of the several combinations that work in sustaining community radio. But at the same time, there is also the aspect of, you cannot really take the policy issue out of all of this, because policy has a huge impact on sustainability of community broadcasting. In Nepal, for instance, we had our first community radio established way back in 1998, the first one, in fact, in all of South Asia, and yet we do not have a clear definition or policy guiding community radios in the country. So what in effect happens is that the government applies the same kind of taxation that it does on commercial radios, and that really kills community broadcasting, really. So, and in some other countries you have restrictions on content or restrictions on transmission power. Governments simply fail to understand the concept, the philosophy, as well as the technological part of it. So sustainability is also very deeply impacted by that. So how do you organize yourself at the station level? It has a bearing over your sustainability, but at the same time, what kind of national policies or guidelines or laws do you have also has a huge bearing over your sustainability.
We do have a couple of questions now. So what I'm going to cross my fingers and hope that we can answer quite a few questions. So let's see how we go. The first one is from Sitska B. I hope that I've pronounced that correctly. We are an NGO that are thinking to start using Mojo crowdsourcing more. Tamseel, this sounds like one for you. Do you have any tips for us to start? How do you get people to join? And what is a good platform to use?
So obviously the platform will be PLUC, but depends, what country are you in? Clearly depends on that, because everybody has a different way of doing it. But I'm going to give an answer which is keeping non-profit way of working in mind, at the same time the community zero address in mind, with an example. So the first and the foremost thing is that you need to train your own team, which means when you're not training your own team, you realize that you're struggling with even community engagement basics. If you have a team which already engages a community that you're benefiting, that's the best team. I think creating champions within your team is the first step. As soon as you start doing it, I think you realize that the learning goes from learning basics of how to make videos, where you can not only fundraise, but at the same time tell community stories and fundraise, to then you start improving the quality of videos. But at the same time, as soon as you're reaching out to the community, the first training you'll realize, if it's not organized in a way where the community is getting direct benefit out of it, you realize that the interest in the community will be low. Let's say if you're training 100 people, you would be able to engage 5 to 10 people out of the 100 people. And that's the natural conversion rate that happens when you start doing that. Because you're actually wanting your community to, your objectives for engaging the community needs to be very clear when you're using Mojo. Do you want them to give you videos where you want to use those videos in your promotional materials? Versus do you want them to create videos on their own and upload directly on platforms? Because that gives you lesser control. So I think the process of creating champions, training your team, you're able to create a mechanism where you know that how and when these communities start submitting these videos, you're able to do it. The identification of community is very easy. You realize there are various community members who might have strong stories, but might not have the apps to use it, right? Which means that someone would be very good, but might be using a feature phone, right? Or someone will be very good, might not have access to internet. These are challenges we face in India, because you have people who are great anchors, but they don't have smartphones. How do you connect that? Which means you build various teams and divide the community into various teams to make sure that the person who is not really confident in speaking is able to connect to the person who's already a local level champion in speaking. So combination of all these things really helps. I think I would definitely suggest platforms, if you're going for community, especially in the nonprofit world, as a platform, the first testing is really good when you're using Facebook groups. I think for us in India, when we started PLUC, before we started uploading communities on our own platform, we use WhatsApp. At a point in time, we had 700 WhatsApp groups. I can tell you this, it's a nightmare to manage them. And always the biggest tip for WhatsApp groups is make sure that your WhatsApp groups are 7 to 10 people maximum, not 200 people. That is chaos you're entering into. You will never be able to get out of that black hole. 7 to 10 people per WhatsApp group divided into issues, getting regular tasks is the first step. So when you start training your team, you're able to realize that these two tools really help in community engagement. What we've realized after you reach a stage where you have at least a few stories which you can put out, building partnerships with, let's say you have a lot of digital platforms like PLUC in India, which help in making sure those stories go out. Start partnering with them to make sure these stories have a reach. And once you get feedback, you can decide if it's working or if it's not working. So that's one thing that I would like to suggest. I think from a training, the most amazing thing to realize is that initially when we started, we never used to invest in any kind of Mojo kits. And right now the PLUC Mojo kit is a small tripod, mic, which is a Boya mic. And you get these two things to make sure you use it in the phone. The biggest challenge we see in nonprofits is the audio, right? And audio is something that you need to tell them, because every smartphone that they buy, they get an earphone. A lot of times we've seen communities sharing these earphones, right? So we've trained communities which are Rohingya communities who are settled here. In the coronavirus, during the coronavirus, we were able to literally get stories out of migrants who are stuck in shelters. During riots, we've seen people send us audio notes because it's such an emergency. But what we've seen is during emergency protests and riots, people have started using their phones even more than ever. And this is a massive change which we've seen in 2020. And how they use it and keeping those basic learnings in Mojo in mind really helps. It clearly depends on the issue, but these are basics. I'm telling you, it's a lot of organizational team management before you even go to the skills part. Once you go to the skills part, the two platforms I've mentioned are really good to start. But for nonprofits, what I know, because Twitter is a very close partner with us for a lot of things, Twitter is amazing because you need to make sure these stories are reaching out to policymakers in a way where you're enabling advocacy or supporting advocacy, and Twitter is the best thing to do. Where views and reach don't matter, but Twitter has started this new thing called Fleet, and there are lots of new tools being introduced to support nonprofits. So definitely these three platforms, look at it at different stages of your campaigning and advocacy and fundraising, how you want to use it. Yeah.
Super. So we have a few more questions, and I'm going to ask both my panelists to be a bit more zippy in their responses, which would be great, because then we can ask perhaps 3 or 4 more questions would be terrific. So let me just, no, cool. I think the work that you're doing, both of you, is so relevant. To me, it makes complete sense to have a sort of extended response. Tamseel, that was so useful and interesting. There's a question here, which I certainly have a view on this, but what would be the future of community radio, Suman, when people are increasingly moving away from electronic to digital media? And perhaps when you think about that, because I know there are some obvious answers with regard to just using a smartphone app to do a podcast, how do you include and engage the older generation into new trends of broadcasting?
Yeah, sure. And I would also like to point out, Corinne, that there is one more question. I think this has a reference to community radio, which is from C. Yong Leaf, asking how if there are any transferable ideas. And I think those two questions are in some ways connected.
Perfect.
Yeah, radio is a great survivor. I mean, experts have been predicting dire future of radio since such a long time, and radio has survived. And one of the things that we have recently seen in the past 1 decade is convergence and of media. And like when you're talking about engagement journalism, that was what was ringing in my mind all the time. Engagement journalism is not yet a buzzword in community broadcasting, but what is very fashionable in community radio at this moment, if you like, is convergence of media. Radio, the traditional form of doing radio, production, broadcasting, listening has changed massively. Now people use mobile phones. There was a time when radio used to be a family affair. I remember when I was growing up, we used to have a radio in the middle of the sitting room, and the entire family would sit around it and listen. And it's no longer like that.
You had one of those.
Yeah. Yep. So so the whole definition of radio is also changing now. Podcasting is there. I mean, it depends on who you're talking to, what your audience prefers. If you're talking to the young people, if you're talking to senior citizens, or if you're talking to very specific interest groups, all of that determines what platform you use. Whether you put yourself as on Facebook, your audio on Facebook or YouTube on some other platform, or you still stick to traditional broadcasting is something that's determined by the preference of your audience.
Suman, so if you don't mind, I would love to just dig specifically into that though, because I think it's a it's a shared challenge in the developed and developing world. As a generation and also an economic demographic has access to digital, how do we bring our elders and perhaps our economically disenfranchised with us on the information journey? What are your thoughts on that?
I go back to this whole idea about, I really oppose this idea about proxy representation. And that's what has been happening in the media for a very, very long time. There was a time when the state or the government claimed that it was speaking on behalf of the poverty struck people, or the farmers, or the teachers, or the students, and so on. Then corporate broadcasters came in, and they claimed to be doing the same. And sometimes not-for-profit broadcasters, unfortunately, also fall into that same trap. So the idea is, how do you ensure that people, ordinary people, if you like, can have ownership over media? And if you simplify media, then that can really happen. If you keep it complex, if you keep it within the realm of something that the government feels needs to be regulated, then unfortunately government feels that it needs to regulate everything. But nevertheless, if you keep it in the simplest form, then I think people can have access. And I just, at the moment, to tell you frankly, I just have a very general idea that on one hand, the regular broadcasters need to be more sensitive towards the information need of the vulnerable people, the kind of people that you've mentioned. But at the same time, I think a lot of thinking has to go as to how do you bring those tools and skills in the hands of the people that you mentioned, the senior citizens, or women in special conditions, or all sorts of other marginalized people, marginalized on the basis of religion or caste, or on social classes, and so on. So I think we haven't found the panacea for it. But we have to keep working towards it. At the same time, be very mindful that it is something that needs to be done.
We have a question. Oh, sorry, Tamseel, did you need to?
I just actually wanted to add a point, if that's okay. I think one of the, when I was talking about the family violence campaign, where we were training women who were going door to door and use their phones, we realized that the change of behavior in them had come through community radio platforms, where they were listening to them in Jharkhand and Bihar in smaller areas, where they actually listened to it on, and this community platform is specifically called Gram Bani. And we realized that they were open to more change and more conversations and more risk after they started realizing and understanding the issue through community radio. So the power of community radio is amazing. And a lot of our creators are first like community listeners, and then they understand the issue. And we've seen this cycle happen. So the power of community radio, even in adults, and most of these women are adults and small business owners. So it's a very interesting combination of things that happens.
There's a question here from Amy Wang, and then there's a question I'd quite like to ask, if I may. So Amy asks, what do you think is the future of community broadcasters in a post-COVID-19 world as media organizations continue to shrink with widespread job cuts? I think this speaks a little bit to the sustainability issue, but in the new normal, what is the role of community broadcasting, Suman?
We've been recently talking to community broadcasters across the region, from Bangladesh to Nepal to Indonesia and so on. And one thing that has come across very clearly is that on one hand, the income has shrunk, definitely. The money you owed, the advertisers owed you, they are not paying, and there's no guarantee that more money will come. But at the same time, you're also having to spend more in doing new programs. So on one hand, the income has gone down. On the other hand, the expenditures have gone up. So this is a very difficult situation. There's no doubt about it. and a lot of people are losing jobs in the community radio sector as well. But then there is also good news. We were recently talking to our colleagues in Australia, where the community radio sector is highly evolved and a very old sector, a very strong community radio sector. And we were told by our colleagues that not a single person has lost a job in the community radio sector in Australia. And I reckon that one of the reasons that is happening is because community radio is primarily volunteer-based. So we know of community radios where there are, let's say, 1,200 volunteers, and each volunteer takes time in managing the technology of the radio station or doing programs on a regular interval. So nobody is overburdened with work. So nobody is really using community radio as the bread and butter kind of a place. It's a place that you go and you exercise your rights to communicate, or you exercise your interest to talk to people, to do some radio or whatever. So there's no doubt that community radios do have an income crunch, and therefore expenditures will have to be tightened, and that might have a bearing over how it is able to pay its employees, or even volunteers for that matter, for their transportation, or for the tiffin cost or things like that. But on the other hand, because they are largely volunteer based, they don't have to bear the brunt in the same way that let's say commercial broadcasters will have to bear.
We do have one more question, and it's been asked twice, so I do want to make sure that we make time for it, and then I'll do a little promo for what's coming up next. It's from Jawad Hussain, who's in Bangladesh. It's a question to you, Tamseel. How do we connect vulnerable communities such as slum, refugee, coastal area people? Jawad's referring there to Bangladesh, but of course one might refer to the most marginalised anywhere. Yeah. How do we bring them with us?
So Abhi, in the last 1 year, and I think even global politics and everything, I know the politics happening in Bangladesh as well, and in India it's similar. What we've realized is when we're training very vulnerable groups, which are like affected by, let's say, communal violence, or affected by things which you usually would be very hard for you to access to find creators there, right? Is that we realize that they're very scared of speaking up, right? When you think of access, it's very important, we've realized, even when we go and train them, to have someone from the community there with them so that they feel comfortable in learning. I think that's one thing. And there are lots of options. I think if we realize that in every area you will find someone who's a community hero, which really simplifies this process. When you talk about connecting them, I think there are tons of tools, and social media being a very, very strong tool. I would suggest there are lots of protocols mentioned by UN, and lots of protocols, especially when you talk to refugees and understand the policy, to make sure that you're not putting them into danger. And that is a thing that you should critically work with. And if you have nonprofits who already have access to communities like this, these are the best ways to reach out to those communities. Because believe me, every nonprofit needs support from the Mojo community. And I think a lot of us have already trained. We know that the support and the translation of the support goes into various ways. And the aim is that it reaches to communities. So this really helps in doing it. And especially connecting them to platforms. Well, if you have a support system and a lot of people volunteering in order to make sure they can voice their opinion, it becomes very important. I think the challenge you'll face is that putting them in danger, which means you need to sort them out through protocols and the kind of stories you're saying, so that they feel safe as well. Yeah.
I'm just popping a note into the chat because, yes, so sorry, you caught me out. So our next live is coming up shortly. There's a note there though from Li Zheyong about reaching out to senior citizens. And one of the things that's occurred to me, and we're experiencing it right now, is that with something as simple as a smartphone, I'd be interested to see just in the chat box if people could type yes, if they're joining this chat on a smartphone. My parents, who are in their 80s, have learnt to use Zoom as a result of COVID, which has been really interesting. And so, you know, we've gone in this household to, oh, I don't really know what Facebook is, and I don't really understand what digital is, and so on. A couple of weeks ago, my mother, who literally turned 80 2 weeks ago, came into my room. She said, I've worked out how to use YouTube, which was awesome because, you know, that means that she's part of the conversation, and she's part of the conversation because of COVID. That's the only way that she could keep in touch with her grandchildren. Now, obviously, there are people who can't participate. And Suman, I know you've talked a lot about the need perhaps in media development projects for donors to not just think about training, but also perhaps to think a little bit more about equipment, that if you can't tell a story digitally because you don't have a phone, then you can't tell it. But certainly just the low level access with a smartphone does bring people into the global conversation, which I think is very exciting. Listen, it is 3 minutes to the hour, wherever we are, or 3 minutes to the half hour in Delhi. So I will wrap this up. You've been listening to Suman Basnet, who is with the World Association of Community Broadcasters. He's the Regional Director for Asia Pacific. Suman, I'm just going to ask you and Tamseel to pop your contact details into the chat just before we wrap up. We've also been joined by Tamsiel Hussain, who's the founder and chief executive of People Like Us Create in India. If you've registered for mojoconference.asia, you can network with people. So do reach out and let both of our guests know any questions that you might have. My name is Corinne Podger. I'm the director of the Digital Skills Agency, and I've been co-organising the conference with CAS Media Asia. It has been such a pleasure having everybody with us, and that we will wrap it up for now. So thanks so much, everyone, and take care and stay safe out there. All the very best.
Thank you very much.
So much. Thank you.
Bye.
See you. Bye, Suman. Bye, Corinne. Bye, everyone.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye.